Deputy Mary Lahegaral, Minister for Justice and Home Affairs.
Charlie Hackwell, Policy Lead for Violence Against Women and Girls.
Constable Richard Vibert, Minister for Children and Families.
I'm Keith Bosman, Director of Improvement and Transformation.
Deputy Kirsten Roll, Minister for Sustainable Economic Development.
Elizabeth Blompier, Senior Policy Officer in the Digital Economy Team.
Okay, that's great.
And just to say, we have Christoph as well, Christoph Reedon.
Yes,
And Andrew Heaven.
yeah, yes, because I was going to say if anyone comes up to the table to speak, if they say their name. So we have 1.5 hours for this hearing. So thank you, everyone. And if I start with the questions. So firstly, there's a question to each minister. So please could you briefly explain what your position is on the policy of online safety, with particular reference to online safety for children? So I don't know who wants to start.
I can start if you want.
Yeah.
Obviously, the Violence Against Women and Girls Task Force recommendation is in relation to this particular area, and the Government of Jersey has committed to funding to invest in a comprehensive and ongoing programme of learning and development in order to strengthen the capacity of a range of services to effectively support victims and respond to online and technology facilitated abuse. This will cover both adults and children. We are in the process of commissioning the Refuge Technology Facilitated Abuse Team in the UK to carry out this work, as this agency is the only specialist service in the UK that directly supports victims facing complex technology facilitated abuse concerns. Work will begin in Q1 of 2025 and run for 2 years. Aim of this work is to build on Ireland's capacity to respond to these forms of abuse, rather than to create a dependency on off-Ireland expertise. Officers are still in the process of scoping which services will be offered the training, but at this stage we can confirm that it will be made available to the States of Jersey Police, school safeguarding leads, social care services for children and adults, Jersey Domestic Abuse Service, Dewberry House Sexual Assault Referral Centre, and also FREDA.
Okay, so can I just say that this is about illegal harms to do specifically with violence against women and girls?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Chair, may I ask the Minister, could you just repeat the name of the organisation that's doing the review, please, so I can put that down because I missed that, sorry.
Well, it's the commissioning, is the Refuge Technology Facilitated Abuse Team. Sorry about that, Constable, I have tongue-tied words sometimes.
That's a lot of them. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Okay.
Right, okay, I can go along.
Yeah.
Well, CIPES has its own online safety policy. The purpose of the online safety policy is to highlight in schools, youth services, CAMS and other parts of our organisation good practice in keeping young people safe online in what is a technologically quite complex world. The policy is aimed at all, as I've said, but I think crucially the thrust of it comes through the schools. It is also, and it's based on the underlying principles of the UNCRC. Our keeping in safe in education policy, and that's the main thrust of the project, identifies the need to keep children safe online and highlights the importance of filtering and monitoring content. Also includes significant staff training. This policy sets out the expectations of schools to keep children safe and covers conduct of staff, internet filtering, blocking and monitoring. And within the monitoring, we are looking for keywords that might come up. Those are reported through the head teachers each day. They also look for not just individual perhaps schools, but whether those words are coming up across groups of schools. which would be a more significant problem. We also cover social media use, cyberbullying, self-harm, radicalisation, sexting, 18 plus content, illegal content, images and data protection. In other areas such as CAMS, there are perhaps slightly more specialist services to cater for that, but they cover the same areas. All schools must adhere to the policy, so that is a given. They then filter that through to children in education, often via online links and written policy. I can look at one in particular, their online safety policy contained within the school's overreaching safeguarding and child protection policy, and you would find that that aligns with our own policy. And the aim of this is to help students and staff through educational and professional learning. Again, it's the use of filtering and monitoring, encouraging students and staff to report anything they encounter online which concerns them, encouraging wherever possible students and staff not to engage in inappropriate activities, and that's quite important. It's not just the children, but it's the staff as well. Encourage students and staff to communicate appropriately, using only school email addresses to communicate with students. And if we move away from schools for a minute, we can look at, for instance, what the youth service do. The youth service go out to schools themselves, and they have presentations which cover staying safe online at home, how to change privacy settings, how to turn off your location, sexting, cyberbullying, and those are also available to parents. Those can be found through the YES website, that's the Youth Inquiry Service. Also, they cover this, those children who are part of the youth clubs. These are covered in specific presentations within the youth clubs themselves. So we do our maximum to cover, to alert children to the problems, to encourage parents to be responsible, schools to be responsible. I could go on, but I think I'll stop there.
Thanks. And this is mainly then about awareness and responsibility of the schools,
Yes.
the users themselves and the parents, and the awareness around that then, I guess.
And I should say we have, as we're corporate parents within our children's home, we have filtering and monitoring service, and there are quite strict rules if anyone is found to have broken those. They may be slightly more strict than some parents would keep. So, but we have fairly strict rules about that within the children's homes as well.
So can I just ask you one question then? So does ensuring online safety for children, as you're the Children's Minister, do you think that requires a legislative approach from government?
Legislation is useful as a tool. Would it make any difference today if the legislation was there? I don't think it would change our approach. I think I think that our approach is extremely good, despite the fact that legislation isn't here. When it gets there, it's a tool that might allow us to request certain content to be blocked. There is actually quite a bit of criticism about the UK online law that has recently been introduced, in that it really started looking at inappropriate content and then spread out into a number of other areas. And the belief is that it's become so complex that it is difficult to enforce in some cases. And I think we need to avoid that. I am wholly supportive, and you'll hear from the Minister for Economic Development, but I'm wholly supportive of a local law. this is a fast-changing world, and legislation has to be able to keep up to it. If we had been part of UK legislation, it would be impossible to change it without going to the UK first. So I'm wholly supportive of a local law.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And yes, as Minister for Sustainable Economic Development, I have responsibilities which, in one sense, you could term are about the infrastructure of the internet, and I kind of undertake those responsibilities principally through the telecommunications law. But also it's about the safety of users, and particularly about the privacy of users, and I undertake that through the Jersey Data Protection Authority law and the Jersey Data Protection law. Those are the main tools that I have at my disposal at the moment. We are developing the cybersecurity law, and that will also have an impact here, particularly where systems have been breached and potentially harmful content forced into a system through that route. So there is a potential role for cybersecurity as well. From the perspective of the internet itself, it's really important balance. As a matter of kind of policy, effectively we want to see a free internet, free for expression, but we also want to see a safe internet. And that's where I try to strike that balance through those two, particularly those two laws at the moment, the Telecommunications Law and the Data Protection Authority Law. And it is that free and safe internet that is the balance we're trying to achieve and trying to strike.
Okay. So if I can follow up with some questions to you, if that's okay. The panel understands that Jersey was given the option of a permissive extent clause in the UK's Online Safety Act, but the ministers decided against using this option. So could you explain the work that was undertaken to assess that decision?
Yeah, the draft law, so this was presented to me as Minister for Economic Development in November 2022, I believe it was. I mean, I stand to be corrected on that, but I believe it was November 22. And the draft law at that point, which is what I was asked to decide upon, had been carefully examined by officers, and an analysis had been undertaken on that and presented to me. As a result of that analysis, I felt that a permissive extent clause wouldn't have been appropriate for Jersey for a number of reasons. On one reason is quite simply that we are here as the states of Jersey to legislate for the island of Jersey. It is not for the UK to legislate for the island of Jersey. Really importantly as well, as the Connotables has just mentioned, when we bring in a law to Jersey through a permissive extent clause, we have no method of amending that law in the future. Technology is very fast changing, and we would be bringing in a law that islanders would not have been able to amend or change for the purposes of our island. On top of that, at that point in time in November 22, and I believe it still carries through to today, the law that was in draft form in the UK, I'm afraid I will call it was a poor law, and it was a poor law for a number of reasons. It is now being presented as a 300-page law. Quite simply, and I believe even Ofcom have said this, large laws tend to be, the more complex a law, the less easily enforceable a law is. And the UK has presented an incredibly complex law that Ofcom itself, as the kind of delivery partner for that law, has said is going to be very difficult for it to enforce. It included terms at the time, and this was really important in November 22, it was actually, I believe, trying to make an offence of creating legal but harmful material. A new offence under a case of being legal but harmful, I think, was changing the idea of you are guilty of something or you are not guilty of something. They were trying to find a middle third way, which I felt was abhorrent in terms of our concept of how law works, and would be deeply inappropriate for islanders. Effectively, they could have been found guilty under laws in another jurisdiction, and I don't think that would have effectively been appropriate for islanders. They've maintained that idea of legal but harmful, not as an offence, but as characteristics of content on the internet. But Ofcom itself has said that it is very difficult to understand what legal but harmful means. It has said that it is vague, that it is that Ofcom will find it very, very hard to pin down what legal but harmful means. It has the potential as a term to create censorship. And in fact, I believe we've even seen this in some of the prosecutions we've seen in the UK recently, not directly related to this, but how laws which are aimed to protect can actually be used against freedom of speech and against the against perfectly reasonable behaviour, just because it's politically inappropriate or people see it as politically inappropriate. And that's something which worried me a great deal. And so there are, from vagueness to complexity to creation of new concepts within law that didn't exist before, as well as the fundamental inability of islanders to affect that law, were we to accept that law onto the books in Jersey, the inability to amend it. I felt that it wouldn't be appropriate for the island to have a permissive extent clause, because we can and should legislate for ourselves, and that's exactly what we are aiming to do. And then we will have a law in Jersey, or several laws in Jersey, aimed to protect islanders from inappropriate and dangerous content on the internet, and we'll be able to change that, make sure it keeps up with technology long into the future. That's what the States of Jersey is for. The States of Jersey is not there just to take what the UK creates and bring it into our books where we have no ability to change it in the future.
So if I can come back, we'll come back to you a bit later to ask about the laws that
Yeah,
you might be planning.
absolutely.
About going back to the permissive extent clause, can you describe the advice that you received? And I know you've already mentioned officers' work. Was there any independent research or legal advice or anything like that?
I couldn't, this is 2 years ago now, I doubt there was independent research. I believe we probably did have legal advice. There was legal advice at the time.
Okay. Legal advice and officer work.
Yes.
And what consultation or discussion did you have with other ministers in government about making this decision?
I didn't. I was asked to make this decision on my own.
So, would there not normally be a discussion with other ministers around something that might affect the welfare of children?
It wasn't suggested to me at the time, and because I felt that Jersey, and it is a point of principle, Jersey is here to legislate for itself. We are not here just to take the UK's laws and put them on our books. So from my perspective, the important thing was that Jersey works to legislate on this. And I spoke to the then Home Affairs Minister, Deputy Miles, and made it very clear at the time that we would be very happy to work with this and make sure we get the laws onto Jersey's books as appropriate, but laws which are proportionate. The UK has created law for 65 million people and over-complexified it, and Jersey is 100,000 people. There is different routes, and we are now seeing around the world, whether it's from the EU to Australia, different laws which take different approaches to protect their citizens, and they are approaches which I would say are much more appropriate for Jersey. And to be honest, the UK could probably have learned from those.
Okay, so you didn't consult with the Children's Minister at the time?
No, I didn't.
Okay. And how was the decision recorded? Was it in the minutes of a formal meeting or ministerial decision?
It's not a ministerial decision, but it was recorded in minutes.
Right,
It was
yeah.
recorded in officers' reports at the time.
Right, so would other states members have been aware of this decision?
No.
Okay. Was the decision informed by any impact assessment undertaken to consider child rights?
No.
Because the UNCRC requires the best interests of the child are a top priority in decisions that affect them. That wasn't.
No.
That's my
I think it's really important to understand this isn't a ministerial decision in terms of, what is Jersey doing or not doing. This is, do we want to make it possible for a UK law to be brought into Jersey law? And the decision was no, we better make our own law. That's a much better appropriate way to do it. And that way, making that law, you see, you have people, ministers with regard to children's rights, children's services, as well as the Home Affairs Minister with regard to security of the island, are entirely consulted in the making of these new laws.
We've got some more questions, but before we move on to your questions, Mark, did anyone on the panel want to ask anything around these points right now, or we just move on?
Could I just ask that, were you acting in support of officer advice or against officer advice not to implement?
Neither. I was asked for my opinion. I think the question was, do you want to have a permissive extent clause in there? I don't believe officers gave me a view either way.
So there was no view either way from officers, so you took the
I'll ask, Elizabeth was there at the time, but I don't believe there's a view at the time.
We presented the impact of what the UK at that time was doing. So this was following on from officer conversations with DCMS, the UK department that was building the online safety bill. So we'd been having ongoing updates from them since 2019. And then at the point when DCMS were asking whether we were going to would require a PEC for inclusion for Jersey, we worked with our law officers department to understand the impact of what an APEC would and whether we would then extend it into Jersey. And we presented to the Minister the options and had several discussions with the law officers about the scope and scale of what the UK bill was trying to do, what powers it was passing on to Ofcom, and how that would then be a challenge for Jersey.
Was there a time frame at the time?
At the point, yes, DCMS required a response on the PEC within, I can't remember the exact time frame, but it would have been 6 to 8 weeks. So
I'm just interested in your view as well about permissive extent clauses in general, because actually we do have permissive extent
That's
clauses
correct.
in law. So we have it for the Nationality Act,
That's
we have
correct.
it for the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act, and certainly it's my understanding that evidently you're not implementing the UK law without the authority of the Assembly, because it has to be discussed, it has to be debated in the Assembly. So there are examples where the UK, where we have done that, and I'm also interested in the view that it's very difficult to change that.
Well, we can't. We have no ability as an island to amend a UK law. So if we, by extension of a UK law, bring it into Jersey law, we cannot then amend it.
With any updates from the UK, again, we have a choice about whether to implement them using permissive extent clause. And I think the point is the permissive extent clause isn't an automatic extent to Jersey, it is an option.
That it is an option, but it's one that I believe that enables us to fall back far too easily onto UK law, rather than actually thinking for ourselves.
If I could just add just a couple of points for anyone who might be listening, the Isle of Man and I think Guernsey have agreed to
That's
adopt
correct,
the
yes.
extent clause. So Jersey is in an unusual position there. And just for me to say just one thing about the Online Safety Act in the UK. So phase 1 is expected to happen or to start in early 2025. Well, Parliament will finalise the illegal harms codes. This is mainly about sexual abuse of children online. Phase 2 will be about protecting children from harm, and this is the suicide, self-harm, porn and violence against women and girls. So just to add a little bit of information there. And Mark, did you want to go on with your question?
Yes, thank
If
you.
I could just say, all of those things can be dealt with within Jersey's own laws.
Thank you, Minister. What evidence do you have that domestic legislation is the best route forward? And I think that there's many topics that surround this, but my initial concern was how long it's going to take. But can you also tell us about any research that was undertaken that supported that decision?
Well, I've just explained what was, if you don't mind, I've just explained to Deputy Curtis, what was undertaken by officers and then presented to me. But I believe that Jersey, we are an island community of 100,000 people, and we are best placed to understand which laws and how we should create laws for ourselves. The UK's position, certainly at the time in 2022, and I believe this has come through to the actual law that was being implemented on books, was one of a very confused, over large, extensive law that is incredibly difficult to enforce. And so it is a maxim amongst many legislators that no law is better than bad law. And I believe that the UK has brought in bad law in that respect. And the fact that Ofcom is very diplomatically pointing out the troubles with that law, I believe gives credence to that view.
But having then decided not to pursue the permissive extent clause, has that initiated work on our legislation?
We are absolutely working on the legislation, both through the telecommunications law, the data protection law, and I know that the Minister for Justice and Home Affairs is working on the sexual offences law.
Can I just add something there, Mark? Will that cover protecting children from harm such as suicide, self-harm, and the having to give their age
Verification.
verification on porn sites? which is covered
Those
by-
are all things which can be dealt with within our laws.
And has that started already, that work?
The work that has begun on those laws, yes, full stop. I couldn't say because I am not the Home Affairs Minister, so I can't speak for the Home Affairs side of things. But we are looking at all these aspects.
Okay, well, maybe the Home Affairs Minister could tell us.
Yeah, in relation to the domestic legislation, obviously there is the telecommunications law, although that doesn't necessarily fit all of the criteria of what you're talking about. But what you're talking about here doesn't actually fit within the scope, and it may be that there's different elements as we move forward in relation to different areas that we will be looking at in relation to legislation. But what you're talking about, that isn't actually within the scope of what I have here.
So there isn't any work started on these?
If I may, so there were two recommendations from the Violence Against Women and Girls report that related to online safety, and that was strengthening legislation in the areas of intimate image abuse and cyber stalking, which a whole host of work is coming through on, and I think we have specific questions about that later. And then there was a separate recommendation around the regulation of online platforms, which I think, was a particular development in the Online Safety Act that was significant, and that work is going on. I don't know if you'd like to speak to that.
So yes, based on that work, the two sets of work are happening in tandem, where criminal offences to cover digital offences are being worked on by Justice and Home Affairs, and Department for Economy is taking on the enforcement aspect. So we've been doing the research in that area. There are questions on it later. We've been looking at other jurisdictions and what online safety or similar online safety bills have been passed, and those laws are new and upcoming, so we're learning as other jurisdictions are learning, and as we'll go through later in a different question, there are different ways that we can enforce and regulate online harms, and different jurisdictions have taken, or different nation states have taken different approaches. So we're looking at what's worked, how it works, the speed at which it works, and we're gathering that evidence in the background now to present to the Minister options that will be suitable and proportionate to Jersey, and at that moment in time we will share those with the Justice and Home Affairs Minister and the Children's Minister to ensure that what is proposed and what's taken forward is acceptable to all.
Great, and do you have a timeline for that work?
So we are aiming to present our initial proposals to the Minister for a first review in November, and then depending on the feedback received there, we should have something to share more broadly with the wider ministers in early 2025.
Okay, so sorry, Mark.
Not at all, Chair, not at all. You've spoken about regulation and enforcement. What options are there to enact those to the regulation or enforcement of our own legislation?
We have obviously the data protection. The Office of the Information Commissioner is probably the primary route from which we can engage with the major platforms around the world. And there's obviously the Cybersecurity Centre, which has recently been set up and have a cybersecurity law, and that can, as I said, speak to the side where there are particular breaches with regard to internet harms as well. And then the telecommunications law, which is dealt through, I think, just through the Law Office as opposed to any other regulator, and the JCRA. I foresee the data protection, the Office of the Information Commissioner being the likely main vanguard of enforcement.
Okay. I mean, clearly the UK has Ofcom.
Yes.
And, for 63 million people in the UK, that's quite fundable. But I mean, do you think those officers will be able to cope with the sort of levels of complaint that come in?
With 100,000 people in Jersey, yes.
Thank you.
And obviously, but it must also be said that when any law has been brought in, a good example is we've recently in the States voted through the telecommunications security laws, and that places extra responsibility on the Jersey Competition Regulatory Authority. As a result of that extra responsibility, my department is providing greater funding to enable them to undertake the role that that new law creates. Okay. So a new law that put more responsibility onto any authority, whether it's the Office of Information Commissioner or any other, would likely also need to be followed by funding to enable that enforcement to take place. So when I say yes, I don't mean yes today they are set up to do it. I mean, yes, it is incumbent on the department to ensure they are in a place to be able to enforce the laws that we ask them to enforce.
I mean, one of our principal concerns is a jurisdiction of our size. Are they going to listen to us? I mean, platforms like Facebook, are we going to have any impact on them at all?
Well, Facebook will be here next month in Jersey because the Office of the Information Commissioner is undertaking a global privacy forum, which Meta, as the owners of Facebook, are taking part in. So yes, I do believe that, because again, you must also think about the devolved nature of these global multinationals. So the data protection officer or registrar for Meta on Facebook is in Ireland. And so we would deal through our Office of the Information Commissioner would deal with that through the Irish office. That would be the case for many of those multinational platforms that actually have their main data protection registrar in Ireland, as I understand it. And so that would be the conduit through which they do it. So it's not a case of trying to find a phone number in Seattle or San Francisco. There are routes through which these legal authorities, which the Office of the Information Commissioner is, are able to work, and it's through those routes that they will. Again, I don't think it's right to think just because we are small, we are unable to do these things. We absolutely can.
I like your confidence. In a quarterly public hearing with the panel on the 22nd of August, when referencing online stalking in the digital space, the Director for Justice Policy highlighted that negotiating power is weak when it comes to multinational entities, as we've just mentioned. Can you address that position, and is it a concern for any of you?
I just did address that position.
Minister?
Well, the enforcement clearly isn't my area. However, do I think that having entered into the, if we entered into legislation through a permissive extent clause, that we'd be any better position? I don't think we would be. We're 100,000 people, and the UK is 65 million, and Ofcom, of course, is a UK regulator. They're not part of, Channel Islands is not part of that. So, to what extent would Ofcom react? I am not convinced that we'd be in any better position. I think actually direct contact with the entity and the regulator who controls them by Jersey is probably a far better approach.
If I may, to Richard's point, Ofcom is not accountable to anybody in Jersey. Ofcom has already talked about itself being overwhelmed by the amount of work that it's going to have to do. I believe it's had to hire hundreds of staff in order to deal with this new law.
300.
There you go. And any islander who then went via Ofcom to raise a complaint, if Ofcom didn't deal with that complaint, the islander would have no recourse. Whereas the authorities in Jersey are accountable to islanders in Jersey through ministers and directly.
Can I just ask then, have you looked at what the Isle of Man and Guernsey are planning to do about whether they use Ofcom or not?
I haven't.
Well, they have no option but to use Ofcom because Ofcom is designated within the law. So they can't, there is nothing in the law about Guernsey or Isle of Man regulators. Ofcom is the designated body. So they have no option.
Okay.
If Ofcom isn't performing, no islander would have an ability to hold that to account. Whereas they absolutely would have the ability to hold both the government in Jersey and various authorities, whether it's the Office of the Information Commissioner or any other, they have the ability to hold those authorities to account for inaction if they felt that was the case.
And I'm aware that in Ireland, for example, which also has their Online Safety Act, that they have actually gone through quite a number of prosecutions.
Absolutely, but that is perhaps why Ireland's law may be better than the UK law. And this is part of what Elizabeth was saying about looking at global options and the examples from around the world. And because I do not believe the UK has set off on the right path on this or the best path, we can look at other places. Australia, I know, is coming out very strongly as a law which looks really quite good, and possibly the Irish one does as well. And we can look at them and model our own law based on what they're doing, rather than just taking what the UK did. It moved really fast, the UK, on this law, but it didn't necessarily, by seeking speed, it may not have got the quality that it needs.
The Irish law will be based on the EU regulations that were issued. It has to be.
Yes.
And those are different from the UK online safety law.
Yeah, I think that
They are
concerns
considerably different from the approach taken by the UK. So I'm not surprised that Ireland perhaps have had some success, because they're based on different principles.
I think our concern as a panel is around whether Jersey children are left exposed, because nearly everywhere else seems to be having these online safety and legislation. Anyway.
When we say everywhere else,
Yeah.
what are we talking about? Because I have a funny feeling
Different
that a
states of the
minority of
USA,
global
the
countries.
European Union, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, and the UK.
I don't think all know the EU has issued regulations, but not every country has put that into domestic legislation yet.
And I
It's
don't
in
know
process,
that. I don't know
but
that
they're no
Guernsey-
closer probably
One
than
at a time.
we are.
I
One
don't know
at a
that
time,
Guernsey on the
sorry.
Isle of Man.
One at a
have.
time, please.
Yeah, we're just trying
Thank
to hold
you.
hearing. Mark, have you finished your
Yes, thank you.
questions? So Bea, I think that's you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to ask this question maybe to the Home Affairs Ministers to begin with. Can you please tell us about any work that the government has done to assess how best to safeguard children and young people on online space from your own capacity, please? Say, for instance, oh,
Okay, obviously in relation to the development of legislation in the space of following the violence against women and girls, recommendation 10 talks about online platforms in relation to how to protect their users. As previously highlighted, we're looking at all available solutions to provide the regulations of online platforms in relation to how they can protect users and remove unlawful content. This approach allows us to draw on best practices and make a law that is appropriate and proportionate for Jersey, which obviously has already been discussed, to enable the fast removal of unlawful content affecting our citizens. This legal area is new and fast moving for all jurisdictions around the world, and we can today see how the respective laws from around the world perform in relation to this practice. There's another recommendation, as in number 11, and the task force recommended that the Government of Jersey should strengthen legislation to address online and technology facilitated abuse. Officers are currently working on this legislation drafting instructions for the following legislative developments, which are anticipated to be finalised by January 2025. So that will be the amendments to the Sexual Offences Law 2018, strengthening legislation to address the act of taking an intimate image of someone without their consent, creating a new offence of distributing an intimate image of someone without their consent. This will include sexually explicit deepfakes, creating a new offence of threatening to distribute an intimate image of someone, create a new offence to address the act of cyber flashing, the act of sending a person an unsolicited intimate image, introducing legislation to address the creation of sexually explicit deepfakes without consent of the person depicted, introducing additional protections for victims on intimate image abuse through the creation of a new expedited process whereby a person whose intimate images have been distributed without their consent or who has received a threat of distribution can quickly seek a court order to stop and prevent the spread of those images. We will obviously also be introducing new stalking law. A new piece of legislation to addressing stalking will be introduced. We recognise that perpetrators of stalking often use both online and offline tactics, and we will ensure cyber stalking behaviours are captured under the piece of legislation in addition to more traditional forms of stalking. So there's lots of I think there's lots and lots of legislation that will be coming through within the next sort of period of time, and a lot of that is looking to go for drafting in January.
So would you say those are coming out of the risks that have been identified by your piece of work?
Yes, obviously as well, there's a piece of work that will need to be done as one of the recommendations, so that part of this, there's now guidance of on forms of online and technology facilitated abuse is now published on the online and technology facilitated abuse gov.je, and that will cover a summary of what online abuse means, a summary of what types of online abuse are illegal in Jersey, information on how to report online abuse to the States of Jersey Police, information on where to access support for victims of this type of abuse, information and advice on how to get intimate images removed from the platforms, information on how to secure technology against cyber spyware and stalkerware, and a glossary of terms relating to online and technology facilitated abuse.
So very right piece of work. May I just ask you, in all the information you've provided me, that if any assessment has been done on the rights, children's rights under the UN Convention, have you done the CREA on that particular piece of work? Would you be considering that?
Yes, so my understanding is that all CSP objectives for the government have been subject to a CREA, so the overall violence against women and girls work stream has been assessed with a CREA. And then, we're still scoping and researching the legislative drafting instructions currently, but as we go through that process, a CREA will be
Every
conducted.
single piece of new legislation will have to have a CREA attached to it.
Just for the purpose of the hearing, thank you for that. Appreciate. Can I ask the Education Minister the same thing in terms of your department? What particular work have you done to assess how best to safeguard the children and young people in online spaces? Your particular department, please.
Yes, I can do that. What I was about to say was that, of course, some of this is very much in the area of the Education and Lifelong Learning Minister. And whilst I can touch on some things that have happened in schools, I can't go into great detail on those. But I can say that within the schools, obviously, we've already mentioned about the electronic means we have of looking at content and keywords. But also there's been work with parents, and parental engagement is extremely important. And that's been carried out by schools' leadership teams in some cases. I know that we're about to actually hear from Victoria College quite shortly about a parental safeguarding seminar. Those things cover, things that have been covered with parents as things like how social media works.
Can I just interrupt for a minute? Sorry, I just wanted to say, we already had in a public hearing questions and answers with the Education Minister.
Yes.
So he's given us quite a lot of information about what's happening through the schools. So perhaps if you could just tell us.
Right, but we didn't know that.
Yeah, so do you have any...
because we actually specifically asked him what he had covered with you.
If I was to ask you, Minister...
Yeah, but I'll move on to what the things that we do.
Yeah.
Because you've asked the question now. Our duties and responsibilities are really covered. The Children and Young People's Jersey Law 2022 sets out the key people and ministers responsible for safeguarding children, their legal requirements, and they don't distinguish between online and offline harms. So that's quite important. We have safeguarding partners, and we work with the Safeguarding Partnership Board, also the NSPCC, for developing and delivering children's safeguarding arrangements within their services. The Safeguarding Partnership website contains the key policies and procedures to support all those working in services to continue to safeguard. The Safeguarding Partnership also provides the key point of contacts to escalate and raise concerns for both professionals and members of the community, including children. So we've got multi-agency safeguarding as well. During 2024, there was new practice guidance regarding online abuse and exploitation.
Would you just mind to mention one or two multi-agencies involved?
Well, I've mentioned one already, which is the NSPCC. We've got other things such as the Brook traffic light tool was launched in January 2024. We had 15 professionals, of course, from various partnerships trained as trainers to understand harmful behaviour and sexual behaviour. And then those have gone on to give, direct that information to groups of professionals in Jersey. Yes?
Within your piece of work, what would you say have been the major risks that have been identified?
I think major risks, there's just not, we haven't just got online risks. Certainly those, we're quite familiar, I think, with the online risks and what is out there and how we have to protect children. But there's a lot more going on out there, potentially with adults grooming children, children being pulled into either sexual or drug-related activity. So those are all, I put those on a par with online safety.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. I think that is enough for now. So if I can just ask the next question, and that will be for the Minister of Sustainable Economic Development. Can Minister please tell us, has any work been done on the digital economy area of responsibility to examine safeguarding vulnerable people, including children, in online spaces? You may have touched in some of those areas, but for the purpose of the questions, if you could just give us an answer, that would be great. Thank you.
So a lot of the work that we kind of do as a department is done through the Data Protection Authority and the Data Protection Authority itself. So it's not so much done directly by us, but through the Data Protection Authority. And they have a huge educational awareness programme. In 2023, they delivered personal information safety sessions to more than 2,500 young people, with 1,671 individuals attending Jersey Office of the Information Commissioner events. And so that's the main conduit through which we engage young people in understanding the importance of their privacy and safety online. Is there anything else from your perspective in the digital economy wider programme? I think that is the main area.
No, only to touch on through the digital economy strategy, developing skills for life in the digital arena is a key element of that, and we're working very closely with our sites counterparts, and the Minister is working very closely with the Through Life Learning Minister in this area to ensure that the programme of work and that is complementary to the work that Joy's doing is and implemented and embedded in schools, both from primary and secondary, and then once you leave schools there's a programme of education still accessible to ensure Jersey citizens remain up to date in their digital skills, especially as it's a fast-changing event and a fast-changing policy area, and so we need to make sure that through life learning is captured. So we're working actively on that with relevant colleagues and sites.
Thank you for that. Again, another question from the Minister, if possible. Has the Government of Jersey undertaken any assessment of existing legislation? I know you've talked at length how you feel Jersey is going to do their own legislation, and happy to do so. But how far did you went out to make that decision? Did you assess any other legislations in place prior to?
So can I ask, I'm sorry, just to clarify, are you asking a very similar question to the one Deputy Curtis asked earlier? Or are you asking a different question about where we are now, as opposed to where we were in 2022?
Well,
It's different, isn't it?
it's a different question.
So you're talking about now as opposed to 2022?
Yes.
That's really what I wanted to check. Thank
Question
you.
about assessment of existing legislation.
And so, yes, that's
So-
part of the work we're currently undertaking.
Yes.
And so I mentioned Australia, Ireland, the EU. These are areas that we are looking at
Existing
around.
legislation here as well, and whether it's sufficient.
Oh, and absolutely, that is part of it. Sorry, I also understood the question to be about exit legislation out there. The hand suggested that. And so we're both looking at our existing legislation, understanding what it can do and what perhaps it doesn't do. One of the things, for instance, in the telecommunications law is it's not, it doesn't have any provision for anonymity for complainants, and so that's something which I think is quite important to address. And so we are looking at our own existing laws, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, but also a review of laws outside, and the Chair alluded to a lot of them just a few minutes ago. They are laws that we're looking at to understand kind of what from those laws should we be modelling on and what shouldn't we be modelling.
Thank you for that. I mean, we just really want to know how you're planning to go ahead and how you managing the portfolio. Okay, would you say the animosity is a bit of like the next step, that you found there is a kind of weakness when you just use the word
Anonymity.
Anonymity,
That is
sorry.
a weakness. Yes.
Yes.
I mean, there will be others, and there won't. The laws that we have at the moment, both the data protection law and the telecommunications law, where they've been really helpful, is that they've been designed in certainly telecommunications law and its more recent amendments to cope with the ongoing technological revolution, for want of a better word. Technology is constantly changing, and particularly I think it's Article 51, where it has been designed specifically to cope with future technological changes as best as it can without having to go back and always change the law. So that's a potential strength there, and that's also one of the things that I think is a strength about us designing our own legislation, is that we can make sure that it is fit for the future, and isn't. And there is an art to that.
That may be part of my next question to you. So can you tell us if what's your next step in terms of the planned work you're doing in this area?
So the next steps are basically so officers are doing that work that I've outlined. They will be coming to me in the next couple of months to effectively give me an options paper as to best next steps forward. And that's exactly what we can start sharing, and then we can start sharing with the scrutiny panel where we're going with that.
Thank you.
Those are the next steps, and their imminence, which I think is really important.
We look forward to that. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, did you want to come in?
No.
Okay, thank you. So my other question again could be to either of Minister, maybe give Home Affairs Minister an opportunity with regards to the protection against cyberbullying and threatening messages. Are there that are in current telecommunications law? Can you advise the panel how this is enforced? If you've got an enforcement.
Sorry, can you repeat? I don't know what you're asking me.
I will reread the question. With regards to the protections against cyberbullying and threatening messages, they are in the current telecommunications law. Can you please advise the panel how this is enforced?
Well, if somebody's got threatening messages, then those matters would be reported to the States of Jersey Police, and that information and evidence would be provided. I think it's important that we do encourage people. The legislation might not be perfect, but it's still important to actually make those complaints and provide that data. In relation to the recommendations under the Violence Against Women and Girls, there was two recommendations, 3 and 24, because the ministers. So basically, we've committed to developing a centralised database on violence against women and girls in Jersey. As part of the requirements of that database, data on incidents of online and technology-facilitated abuse incidents will be collected. In particular, the data on non-consensual intimate image abuse, cyberbullying, cyberstalking, online gender-based hate speech and cyber harassment will be collected. So I think what's important, until we've got all of these pieces of information gathered and all of this work done to improve our legislation on this topic, I think it's still important that people report those offences, because even as I said, the law's not perfect. It's still an opportunity for us to be able to gather that information, so we actually do get a clear picture, and obviously hopefully we will be able to deal with any suspects that come out from that. So it's still important that people do report it, even though, as we say, that the telecommunications law isn't perfect.
In terms of cases, are you in a position to share any data about the numbers that have been reported to the police at this moment in time, or?
No, so the first round of reporting on the centralised data set will be in the first quarter of next year for the last quarter of this year, and where we'll be in a place, and obviously as that data set progresses and becomes more rich, we'll be able to track trends over the year and understand patterns better.
Could we maybe be kept on the loop when you get that data, so it will help us to understand?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you. That's good. Okay, so I'm not gonna ask you any further questions about data, but I will ask you, what are the enforcement challenges of the telecommunications law presently? Is there any at all, or
Well,
as you see it?
I think the thing is that there's no the unusual thing about the telecoms law. It comes under Article 51, which is improper use of telecommunication systems. It's used as a catch-all for these forms of abuse in lieu of a purpose-built framework, which would better reflect any sort of advances in modern technology. So, of course, this legislation's been used for text messages, and obviously was used for abusive phone calls, annoying phone calls, particular sort of stalking type of offences. So, I think, as I said, moreover, as this offence does not sit with the sexual offences law, there's, as Deputy Morale said, there's no protection of somebody in relation to this case and their anonymity if it went to court. So I think that's the sort of challenges with it, if you like.
And that includes no specific protection for children and young people, would you say?
Well, it would be slightly... The court case in relation to children and young people would be different anyway, because you would obviously seek to get those protections of a young person not being identified, of course. A young person wouldn't be identified, like you wouldn't have a young person identified as a suspect. But in relation to, sexual offences, the legislation makes it quite clear that you don't name the victims. But of course, in relation to these type of offences, because of the law, that wouldn't be that criteria. But nothing would stop you actually asking the court if that was possible, because you've got those sort of facilities to do that. But this is where the law does actually lack, is from that point of view.
And I must say that's something that I'm really keen to address. And that can be addressed in the telecommunications law.
Yeah, I would say that's very important, isn't it? If judges is to make their own laws, you need to make sure that is paramount on top of your priority, if I can say that.
Agree.
Yeah,
definitely. It's whenever anything with a kind of sexual element to it, or even bullying where there's no sexual element to it, where you've clearly got this kind of significant imbalance of power, and someone's been victimised. Usually, I think it's really important that the complainant is able to benefit from that anonymity. Otherwise, they just won't come forward, or they're much less likely to come forward.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just let Charlie share something with us.
I would just like to add that obviously, because the misuse of telecommunication system offence isn't a sexual offence under the sex offences law, it also means that perpetrators of that type of abuse aren't subject to the same measures that they would be under the sex offences law. So, you're not going to be put on a register. I don't think that the gravity of what you've done is recognised in current legislation because of that. And all of our intimate image abuse offences will be inserted into the sexual offences law, so we'll be resolving that issue.
So I suppose that's a weakness in itself and needs to be addressed. Yeah. Thank you. I'll leave it for now. I think.
So Helen, I think, isn't it?
Thank you. Lots of talk about UK Online Safety Act and EU Digital Services Act.
I'm minister for neither.
Are you minister for neither?
For neither of them. It's relevant. I don't know them in and out.
The question is going to be, and I think you will find this relevant to you, is whether, because we haven't adopted elements of the UK Safety Act for all the reasons that you've articulated, and clearly the same thing for the EU Digital Services Act, is there a risk that Jersey-based users could be classed as a rest of the world category when accessing certain websites? So, for example, it might mean that they see a different version of the site where factors such as age-restricted measures, for example, won't apply.
I genuinely don't know is the answer to that. I'm afraid I have to.
Do you think there is a risk because we're kind of sat outside of the UK system, sat outside of the EU, that we're just
I don't think there has to be that risk, because again, you can draft your laws to reflect principles within other laws. So Jersey, for instance, has plenty, even following Brexit, we have plenty of laws which, including the data protection law, which are designed on the principles of the EU Data Protection Directive. And as a result of that, we are very similar, very compliant, and actually have the same kind of...
work had to go on to align the two.
Yeah, and so by aligning to certain principles, it would reduce the risk of that a great deal. And so I think that can be worked around if that is a risk.
And is there any work being done to test that understanding of what the impact is going to be of the implementation?
Good question. Again, I don't know the answer, but we can make sure we get an answer to that, as in during the course of our work.
Yeah. We've touched on some of this earlier, but just to clarify, really, the UK Online Safety Act is introducing some new offences, content that promotes self-harm. What is Jersey's position on this? Will you talked earlier about the difference between stuff being illegal and creating offences for stuff that's not illegal. I guess it's the same principle. So how will our legislation cope with material that promotes self-harm or includes, promotes facilitating suicide,
things like this, absolutely. No, this was in response to the question that the Chair asked earlier. These are things that we will look at to see how we can ensure that laws do cover those things. And so it won't, but it's too early to say at this moment how it will do that, because I'll be receiving that work in November, and it will be then that I'll be able to answer that question more fully. I can't answer it right now, it's too early.
I think we'll be interested, won't we, in the fullness of time, about the kind of consequential amendments to other laws as a result of this. And I guess we're not going to know that until we've got the law drafting back. Okay. So I know you said earlier that you're expecting the policy stuff to be ready Q1 next year. Is it realistic to suggest that we'll have legislation in place during this term?
I would like to think, when it comes to amendments to existing laws, that can be done more quickly. But I also know from my previous experience in the last term of office that when you get into that final year, effectively, there is a strong focus on what is going through legislative drafting, and I believe it's probably led by the Chief Minister. Priorities are chosen, and so this is why when it came to the triennial regulations, I kept citing the fact that I have no control over law drafting to know whether something will get through or not. And I do know from my experience in the last assembly that as you get into that final year, I believe it's the Chief Minister, will be taking a view as to which elements of law he wishes to take forward this side of the election. So it's really difficult to know that, I'm afraid.
My next questions were going to be sort of clarification of a few technical aspects, but I do appreciate the policy is early in development, so perhaps we could ask those at a later date. Particularly interested about where the responsibility for regulation sits at each of the stages of creating content, uploading, etc. But I guess one of the questions, and you have touched on it before, but again, how are we going to ensure that the protections about freedom of speech and rights to access information from the media are going to be balanced?
All I can do is give my kind of guarantee as Minister that I will always seek to ensure that there is some freedom of speech, but we have to protect people. So when I say some freedom of speech, I think it's really interesting that the idea of freedom of speech can be taken to such an extreme that it becomes almost abusive in itself. And I would say that you can see that in some of the more extreme content that you see on Twitter. So not sexual content particularly, or even terrorism content, but some of the political. I'm thinking US election type content. There is, with freedom of speech comes responsibility, and that's how you balance it. There are responsibilities without freedom of speech, and I will always, because I believe the need for freedom of speech in a free society and democratic society, but I absolutely, truly believe that you have to balance that with responsibilities. The laws will show what those responsibilities are. I think all of us, as when we become elected for the first time, as citizens, we suddenly become very aware of what our speech can do, and we learn through our period in office. And so I think I'm probably talking to a group of people who understand that sense of responsibility, but I do know there are people who I might believe take the idea of freedom of speech to an extreme, and they effectively forget that there comes responsibility.
I mean, do you think that the protection of the vulnerable children in particular should trump freedom of speech?
Well, and yes, to some extent it already does, in the sense that we don't name, people underage. And so I think that's and very few people would question that as a principle. And yet that is actually a slight infringement on the freedom of speech. It's saying to you or me, you cannot name that person. And so I think it is already an accepted principle that when it comes to children, particularly vulnerable children, these freedoms can be, tempered. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Catherine.
Okay. I will go to this question for the Minister for Children and Families. Please could you confirm what the Government of Jersey as a whole organisation considers its duty?
Somebody's pencil.
So please could you confirm what the Government of Jersey as a whole organisation considers its duties, responsibilities or legal obligations to be with regards to safeguarding the welfare of children and young people in online and digital spaces?
Right, so I think I mentioned before, this is actually covered in the Children and Young People's Law 2022, and it sets out our legal responsibilities. We're accountable for developing and delivering children's safeguarding arrangements. We're responsible for their safety. And we have, I spoke earlier about things, set up the Safeguarding Partnership Board, on which there are a number of ministers. There is I think there's a ministerial safeguarding board, isn't there? So I don't know what to say beyond what I perhaps have already said.
Okay, well I could define it a bit more. So, for example, around international agreements, political commitments, does the Government of Jersey, under that law, have responsibility for considering children?
I think they have. I think in all instances they have responsibilities for considering children. I think that is, I said that is one of our key responsibilities, and I would like to think that every minister considers those when, for instance, we look at treaties with other countries and other international agreements. Whether I'm actually consulted, I suspect that in some cases I'm not, because there will be confidentiality around those agreements, which perhaps prevents that. But I would like to think that individual ministers, given that it's outlined in law, know what their responsibilities are.
Okay, and does either of the other ministers want to add anything on that point or not?
No, yes, I guess, because I'm about to speak. So, yes, in the sense that, I think what this law does is it really, particularly from an economic development department perspective, it brings us into, close contact with Justice and Home Affairs, and also with Children's Services and the Education Department as well. And so, from my perspective, as we develop this, we absolutely have to do it hand in hand with those other departments.
Cross-ministerial.
Exactly.
I think that's right. I think it's a piece of legislation that's important, but of protecting children, but also the wider community and vulnerable people as well.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of some instances where we have been consulted on some legislation, and I'm just trying to think of those instances, but certainly some ministers are doing that.
Okay. In fact, my next question, I think you've all answered it already, really, which was about your duties as a responsible minister under the Children and Young People Law. So I think it's Deputy Porry to ask the next question.
Yes, my question will be towards the Home Affairs Minister, and again, I believe the Home Affairs Minister has touched that about the book. So I'm going to ask you maybe slightly a bit in more detail. So how is this legislation being developed in response to the Violence Against Women and Girls Task Force report recommendations?
As I've already said, there's a whole suite of legislation that's being worked on, which I've already mentioned in this panel. Most of the drafting will go to the law drafters at the beginning of January 2025. This legislation is, the Violence Against Women and Girls is a CSP. So basically this legislation will be pushed forward and continue throughout 2025 and 2026. So that is the priority, is all of this legislation, and obviously that will include all of what we've talked about today.
Okay, and do you feel that there is any crossover with our Vogue report and the protection again that the UK has about Online Safety Act, or for instance the EU Digital Services Act, or the Online and Media Regulations Act? Do you find has been crossovers?
Yeah.
So in terms of how we've designed our legislation, we've taken a look at particularly at Commonwealth jurisdictions, because they've got the legislative frameworks that are most comparable. So with a view to England and Wales, we've looked at the Online Safety Act, particularly around introducing offences of distributing an intimate image without consent, threatening to distribute an intimate image without consent, making sure that those offences capture sexually explicit deepfakes as well as authentic images. Mm-hmm. And then there's also the Criminal Justice Bill, which seeks to criminalise taking an intimate image without consent, and also they announced an intention to create an offence of creating a sexually explicit deepfake. Now that's a really hard thing to regulate because you can't necessarily control what people do, Photoshop at home, for example. But what you can address is the different applications that are advertised and AI software that's targeted at people being able to create those deepfakes. So we will be looking into that, and we'll be following along with the measures that are introduced in the UK to understand what approach they take. We've also been guided by the legislation in Australia, so broadly aligned again with the Online Safety Act. Both New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland have brought in offences around recording without consent, distributing without consent, or threatening to distribute. And we've looked at the civil justice approaches that have been taken in both Australia and British Columbia in Canada around being able to have an intimate image removed from a platform, or ordering an individual to delete it from their devices if they've either distributed it without consent or if they've threatened to do so. And importantly, what we're exploring at the moment is the ability to do that pre-conviction, so that you don't have to wait and have that delayed process where something might still be up and still being distributed, but that can happen in a much more expedited way.
Okay, thank you. So would you say that this law drafting, or can you tell me if the work with that law drafting includes any specific instructions about children's rights?
Yes, so it definitely will. So something that we're absolutely minded to be aware of is obviously a big issue in the online safety space for young people is self-generated images. And, you know, we're looking to protect young people from that. We're not seeking to criminalise young people that might have made a mistake. And that will be a big consideration as we draft these, particularly the sexual offences.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mark, I think we haven't got much time left, and I think your questions might be good as written ones. So I'm wondering if we could skip to Helen's on number 16. And I know we've covered it a little bit, but just to actually ask that question
Yeah.
a bit more, yeah?
This is to Minister for Sustainable Economic Development. It's just questions around whether the government has assessed whether there's a risk to Jersey being used as a jurisdiction to avoid the online safety regulations elsewhere, and how that's been taken into account in the policy development.
I don't believe we have made that assessment yet, but it's something that I'm personally aware of and would absolutely not want to see happen. This is not a place where we would want to have people using in any way the island for those purposes. So again, that's something that we should make sure is dealt with in the law. And you do that by making it clear that in Jersey, if you're doing X or Y, you will be prosecuted, you'll be caught and prosecuted, and that's how you do that. So that's why it's really important we do have these laws in place. I think it's also important that from the Ofcom itself doesn't do criminal prosecutions, and couldn't in Jersey particularly either. So from that perspective, there wouldn't be kind of convictions, if you understand.
Can I add to that? In the research that we've been doing, and also just recently, I don't know if you're aware of what happened in Brazil when Brazil banned X from for all citizens. So it required its 22,000 telecoms operators to ban access to X, but it also made it a criminal offence to use VPNs, which are the workaround for citizens to access something that is banned in their country. And so we're seeing these new ideas come and develop through policy and into legal standing. So we're taking those learnings and drawing them down into what we can then use.
And interestingly,
I guess the question is kind of sort of interregnum, isn't it, between the existence of the online Safety Act in the UK and the time it's going to take for us to get up to speed with our own legislation.
If the Online Safety Act was a good law, I'd perhaps agree. But the Online Safety Act, as we made clear, there's very little in the way of prosecutions or even enforcement going on.
But nonetheless, are we thinking about what we're going to do between those two periods of time?
Yeah, I think that is something we should look at.
For the reputational damage.
Absolutely, we do not want that happening in Jersey, and I do think in the interregnum we have laws which are off-putting from that perspective anyway. There are laws which, and I believe we discussed this perhaps a year or so ago, they're not ideal, but they do provide means for prosecution.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, yes, so another question for you, Minister. So, has the government undertaken any consultation or received any representations from external parties or, say, industries with regards to the government's digital policy?
For digital policy, yes. We do regular consultation both with industry and certainly in developing a digital economy strategy. We have done that absolutely in consultation with a wide variety of stakeholders.
Okay, that's good. Would introducing online safety regulations impact the local digital industry or other sectors of the local economy, do you think?
I don't believe it will, because I believe we have a very legitimate set of industries in Jersey. I don't know or have heard of any which are kind of pushing the limit in terms of the type of content we're talking about in this hearing. And if we were to find that out, I'd be really disappointed. But touch wood, effectively, I don't believe we're seen as a jurisdiction. I mean, that's similar to Deputy Miles's concerns, and I think we have to be alive to those concerns. To my knowledge, to date, that we are not a jurisdiction where that happens.
Okay,
but
so that's
we need
reassuring
to make sure
anyway.
Absolutely, but we also need to make sure laws make sure it doesn't happen into the future.
Yes, yeah, not just for now, but
Precisely.
moving forward.
Okay.
Okay, right, I've got another one. I'm the lucky one. Okay, so again, Minister, this question is for you. Are there any plans for the government of Jersey to produce an internet safety strategy or similar strategy?
I believe there is. And so, we have some way to go on it. And to some extent, the work with the Data Protection Authority is already undertaking forms part of that. So this is something that I think we, effectively, we are thinking about at the moment, and it is too early, I think, to say much about it, but it is a place we need to go. It would be multi-ministerial, again, similar to this, but I don't think there is a particular work stream on that at the moment.
But maybe you can just give the panel an insight if your strategy will by any means overlap, say, the cybersecurity focus on the protection, information and data and system security. Do you think you will create your own?
My own what, sorry? Strategy. Oh, strategy. So I think this is a cross-government piece of work. It's not just a Department for the Economy piece of work. So, I don't believe we have started work on that. And so I think it's a question of, is this something we should do and work on? But it would have to be together.
The Minister is working on, through his Assistant Minister, a cybersecurity strategy to update the cybersecurity strategy from 2017 to bring it in pace with the modern era and in line with the future the sustainable economic strategy and the digital economy strategy. So those are in place. We already work closely with our Officer of the Information Commissioner and the awareness raising that he has and data protection remit that he's got on there. So yes, as the Minister says, we'll be bringing all these bodies together along with the cross-ministerial portfolios to understand what the need is to do in this space.
Be able to pick up in a bit more information further down the line, if that's okay.
I think, if I may, I think the issue is there is work going on out there at the moment, and whether it's happening in schools directly through the Education Department, or whether it's happening through the Data Protection Authority and others such as Cybersecurity Centre, there is a lot of work around internet safety going on, but what we don't have is that single documented strategy for putting it all together, and I think it's a really good idea for us to look at that.
Thank you. And again, just for the purpose of the hearing, so Minister, do you think that there should be a specific separate internet safety strategy for Jersey?
I just said, I think that's a good idea.
Good. I wanted you to say it. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, so I'll just have a sort of concluding question if each Minister could contribute. So please could you confirm what the Government of Jersey will do with regards to online safety for children? So what action is required next for that to happen? Who will take that action? And when will the action be taken? So the next step for each of you, please.
If you want to start at this end, if just as we are. So as you said, I'll be receiving options and documents we're in October, so next month. And then that will obviously be choosing options and taking those forward, developing and drafting, law drafting instructions to take it from there, as well as consultation, because I think consultation is a really important part of this. So we'll have the options coming through. As I said, from that point, we'll have something that we can start beginning to show scrutiny more clearly, and that will then have to go through consultation, law drafting, and take it out with legal changes at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Trying to remember the question.
What are the next steps?
What was the next step? Well, next steps, yes.
What action next? Who will take that action and when will that action be taken?
Well, I think currently we are within the confines of the existing laws. We are taking all the necessary action. But of course, the next step is consultation, as far as we're consultation about the new law, and ensuring that it does protect our children. So that's working with the Minister for Economic Development's ministry, and that would be my next steps.
Okay.
Obviously, we've got a suite of legislation to deliver in the next 18 months. That, as I said, that legislation will go to law drafting. Once the law is drafted and brought before the states, then obviously there'll be a programme of training to all of the stakeholders, parties to that, from the states of Jersey Police, Children's Services, etc. All of that training will be provided, and any guidance that's necessary going on to the website, obviously the police website. Some of that has already gone on the site as to what is relevant to what offences, what people need to do, and what sort of agencies they can go to in relation to support as well. So all of that will be in that sort of train coming up to the to June 2026.
Yeah. Can I just add? Sorry, it was just to say that I think, and I genuinely don't know what the education department is doing in this area, and it might be doing a lot. I don't know, but I think one of the areas when it comes to protecting children is obviously to help parents understand how they can keep their children safe. And so I believe, again, the Data Protection Authority does do work in that area, but a lot of the work is also aimed at the children themselves. And so if we were to come up with an internet safety strategy, I think one of the key elements of that would be helping parents understand. I speak as a parent who's obviously been trying to navigate this field as a parent myself, and it's not necessarily very easy, especially with technology moving all the time. So, whereas I had Facebook, my daughter has TikTok, if you know what I mean. And as a parent, you're just not as au fait with these things. So I think parents has got to be a key element of it as well.
Increasing training, increasing education.
Yeah, training and education.
Absolutely.
That seems to be the opinion of the lifelong Minister Education.
Well, he has spoken to us about that, and we can put all that information together. So
Parents'
I think,
education.
but I say that without trying to say it's all on I'm not in any way saying it's all on the parents. I'm just saying that's a part of the whole puzzle that we mustn't miss out.
Of course.
Yeah. And I think we've just about come to the end of our hearing. So unless anyone's got anything else to add, I think we can bring it to an end. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
And it's been really interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.